Hi, and welcome to heaven. This is Raquel Alves,
Julia Kibilda.
and today we have quite an interesting topic, something that we actually first saw on a TikTok and decided could be a cool thing to develop further, which is the whole phenomenon around gender flight.
Yes. So for those of you who don't know what it is, gender flight is similar to like racial flight. I think that's when the term was first coined. And it's basically when one social group flees working environment or a field after another group dominates it. And it can go back and forth and fluctuate in time. And today we're predominantly going to focus on the distinction between the male and female gender flight.
Yeah, so basically in that TikTok, what we saw was this girl kind of like realizing on a lot of fields that were firstly male dominated. As soon as more women starting entering it, slowly and gradually men started to leave. And then they became female dominated. So, like, a very clear example of that is nursing. Today we mostly see it as a female dominated or even just a simply a female job, yet nurses were first predominantly just male until a point in history where you start encouraging women to come in to the point that we actually start arguing that, oh, nursing is like a nurturing type of job, therefore it's only suited for female for the women. And the most interesting thing is that just like nursing with many other fields, is that with the increase of the female dominance, they actually started growing more in the valuation of it, and also the pay range declined. So as soon as it became female dominated, they start being seen less important and also being paid less, which we thought was quite interesting as we start seeing this
So
happening
fucking
in any
sad.
other. I know. Like one of the first things I found very interesting is that because this term of gender flight, which is mostly a male flight, but it can be go both ways. It's an iteration of white flight. So of white families especially in America, when black families started going into a certain neighborhood, the white families would leave,
Yeah.
and those neighborhoods would be like turn into ghettos for those black families. So that the white flight was much more concerned with housing and urban space.
Yeah.
The gender flight, though, is mostly, if not exclusively, workspace
Yeah.
environment, which I thought was quite interesting as to like why is this happening specifically here?
I know it's a very interesting phenomenon because it kind of also shows how like ingrained gender roles kind of are in our society and how women are constantly like devalued. It's like kind of the perfect illustration for that. So I, for example, when it comes to the nursing example that you brought up at the start, I actually read that in the first place, women were not even allowed to go into nursing. It was considered a sacred kind of profession. It was associated either with the church or very superior knowledge that, you know, if you were a nurse and you were able to care about someone medically, you basically had to be like very highly educated, etc., etc. And then that kind of flipped when, you know, it kind of flipped. Actually, it's also quite interesting to mention that because it flipped when the conditions in hospitals were becoming worse and worse and worse, that women were introduced into nursing. So basically the conditions in hospitals were so bad that no one wanted to work in them. And that's when women came in and
Yeah.
started filling out the spaces because it was so bad for everyone else, which is also quite horrible when you think about that. And this is when the whole kind of idea was reframed that, yeah, we're the ones who are naturally caring. Like, there's this woman, I don't remember her name now, but she's kind of famous for the revolutionization of nursing as we know it. And she kind of said that every woman is a nurse.
Hmm.
Which kind of emphasizes this idea that, you know, we're naturally inclined to it, and that's when men started fleeing or getting higher paid jobs within the nursing industry that are more leadership based, you know, or moving up the ranks to doctoral positions in a sense. And the profession slowly started being more and more underfunded and looked down upon. Even now, when you know, when you go to a doctor, very often people, when a nurse takes care of you, people would be like, oh, but when am I going to see a doctor? Whereas
Yeah.
very often you're actually not supposed to see a doctor, and the nurse probably has way more experience than the doctor does in a certain thing that you require, because nurses are very highly skilled and they're kind of trained for very specific tasks and purposes, and sometimes they have way more knowledge about certain things than doctors do just because they simply practice it on a daily basis. And so I thought that was quite interesting how this profession kind of became so devalued, and yeah, it's kind of looked down upon these days.
Yeah, and another catalyst for that to happen was also during the Great Wars in Europe, where with all the men also going into war because it
Yeah.
was mandatory, then the women had to start filling in those jobs, mainly nursing, which was way more needed than a doctor in the field. You would need a nurse way more than you would need a doctor. And I actually find interesting how that kind of nurturing propaganda of the woman nurse taking care of the man soldier really like striked on. But then it made me think, why did the nurse stayed, but for example, the female factory worker didn't? Because they also went to many other fields, but then they went back to the homes and being like a home carer, but the nursing kind of stayed. And I don't know, like, why did that happen? And I think it's, as you're saying, of not only of this rhetoric that was going on before with that woman that revolutionized it. I also didn't know her name. I'm so sorry. But it was in the 1880s, I think, so the century right before, that perhaps why it stayed. Or even after like the Second World War, for instance, that's when the America had economic rise and they started all that thing of traditional values and the secular house with the traditional family. So I think being a nurse really goes ahead with that type of propaganda. And maybe that's why it stayed when many other fields that were half dominated by women because there were just no men around never really stuck, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of a good analogy, I think, would be, for example, like computer programming and sciences. So also during the war, women started really permeating those fields as well. There were more and more women in STEM because men would be, in the field and women were kind of behind the scenes. So there's a lot of examples of women, developing very advanced programming systems, coding systems, etc., etc. And once they kind of developed that and gave way to others, they kind of started being pushed out from the field. Once the field kind of people realized how important that field is, and more people started going into it, women were gradually pushed out by men from it because they weren't considered smart enough to deal with numbers, basically.
Yeah, and that's a whole other point that I think is quite interesting is that when we talk about this phenomenon of gender flight, it's always something quite, I mean, it does look natural seen from afar because it's never overnight. It's like a gradual thing of men starting to leave a growing dominated field by the women. But the other way around doesn't really happen, or it doesn't happen in that way. So as you're saying, in the STEMs in computer science and all that stuff, women were pushed out. They didn't flee because there were men coming in.
No, they were literally kicked out of it.
Yeah. However, so why do men flee when they start seeing a lot of women coming to quote unquote their space? That's
They're
that
threatened because they know they're not going to be as good as us.
yeah, I think
That's
it
my
really
theory,
comes.
at least.
Yeah, but honestly, I think it does come from a feeling of intimidation for sure. Because if you come from the principle that like women are not as good as me in any possible way, because they are by principle inferior to me as a man, if more women are coming into this thing that I'm good at, and they're also good at it, that means that perhaps we're equal, and perhaps these guys just cannot handle that truth. And instead they go, oh, perhaps the problem was not them nor me, the problem was the field itself. The problem was that this field actually was not as good as I thought it was because a woman can do it after all. So I'm
Yeah,
just gonna,
exactly. I'm like way higher than that.
I
So,
really, I mean, I'm not saying that people think like that exactly, but it only comes from this principle, I really think. I mean, otherwise, why would you feel somewhat threatened by more women in your field? Shouldn't you be happy to have more people interested in your field,
I know,
regardless of
right? I think I actually watched the show a while ago. It's quite a new show. It's from Apple TV and it's called Lessons in Chemistry. And it literally illustrates it very well. So the protagonist is a chemist and she works in a big chemical concern, basically. And it happens around the same time period. So in the 50s or 60s. Well, anyways, it happens before women being highly emancipated and regarded sort of equally in the fields. And basically what happens is that she's an incredible chemist and her opinion, she basically is working on this research that's Nobel Prize level research. She's trying to get a grant with this partner that kind of doesn't care about, gender roles and stuff. But when they present their presentation, everyone is like, okay, you need to only put the man's name on the paper because otherwise no one's going to nominate it. Everyone's going to discard it just because a woman's name is on the research, even
Yeah.
though the research is, super sound and valid. And so basically what she does is, because she also cooks. She's a cook and she kind of cooks through chemistry. So she creates chemical reactions through food and different ingredients. So she starts her own, she scouted for a TV show. She calls lessons in, I mean, it's not called lessons in chemistry, but basically it kind of is lessons of chemistry because through like teaching women how to cook, she also
Mhm.
teaches them, that you can experiment and you can do your own like inquiries and you can, even be a chemist or whatever. And
Yeah.
anyway, I kind of like trailed off, but what I meant is that like the show kind of really well illustrates how men became like super intimidated when the woman was working in the same space. So on her team, everyone discarded her, or people were like, oh no, your research is irrelevant, we're not going to even look into it. Whereas actually no one then could replicate it when she was fired and the men tried to take over her research. No one could because they didn't understand it. So they
Yeah.
tried so hard, but they never could. And they were like, oh, there must be something wrong with it.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
Um,
no, you just weren't smart enough.
yeah, I don't know if it's a bit of like out of tension, but even like Einstein discoveries, the theory of relativity, like I mean, I'm not taking his credit, but who did the calculations to prove his theory was not him, but his wife at the time.
Really, I didn't even know that.
Yeah. So basically it was his wife, his first wife, I think only wife. They then got divorced, if I'm not mistaken, who actually did the calculations. And she was one of the few between four women in a whole university in the beginning of the 20th century. And she was a great mathematician, especially when it comes to physics. And yeah, and the reason why Einstein liked her is because she's the only smart one around here in the whole university, and he didn't even like university, or whatever, from what I know. So he's like, I like her because she's the only good one here. But although people always forget about her in Einstein's legacy, but when he won the Nobel Prize, he did mention her name and said, like, I'm here because of her. She did all of this for me. And I think it's important to realize that these discoveries was not a man genius who made it. It was actually a group effort. And I think
Yeah,
that's very
yeah,
important as well. So that's just like a whole other example of a woman who was like completely not
yeah, just like erased.
valued in her field. And she actually contributed to one of the biggest discoveries of humanity, actually. I mean, not even contributed, it's because of her that we had this discovery.
Yeah,
So,
that's
but
true.
anyway,
I feel like basically men get threatened and so they flee, whereas women are so, desperate to be in the field that they want to just flee on their own until they're really kicked out of it. They will try to, make their way and break the glass ceiling and try their ways as much as possible. But it's just really hard because of our society. So for example, like in STEM, I read that like most women go into biology now, which
mhm.
is because it's now coined female STEM field because it's not as mathematic. And there was actually research conducted as to why that might be. And many people found that it's kind of ingrained bias from the time that you're in primary school, etc., when girls are being convinced that they're not as good in math or they
Mhm.
want to be in like other STEM fields. So then later in higher education, they tend to lean more towards biology.
Yeah, yeah, I read that too, and I don't know, like, and then I'm thinking, why are you so threatened? Because if you are threatened, then perhaps we are right,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Like, why do you care so much? If you're good, you're good. Like, why would we have to compete? If you're so amazing, then you shouldn't be threatened by someone you consider lesser than you.
Yeah, I mean, if we were truly lesser than you, then would be no threat, right? So what's your problem?
Exactly. Exactly. That's my point.
I think deep down, it's a bit of was the opposite of an ego booster, so like an ego killer in a sense, realizing that perhaps you're not that amazing after all, or at least you're not the only one who's so amazing after all, and there's someone else of
Yeah.
the opposite gender, and that's infuriating for some, I guess, that is just as good as you, actually, or even better. And I think some men definitely need to get over those thoughts and just learn with others. Honestly, learn with women. You can learn a lot of stuff.
I know. The more I think about it, the more it feels a very like snowball effect. So, you have a field that's dominated by men, and then for some reason they're either like not interested in it anymore, or it doesn't suit them, so they let women in. And then, they gradually start to leave that space because once women are in, they're like, oh, this field is not important anymore. So it doesn't receive as many opportunities. It doesn't receive as much funding, doesn't receive as much promotional opportunities for the future. So they kind of start to go to other avenues. And yeah, and the field kind of becomes devalued completely because obviously women are considered less in our society. So
Yeah, and especially going back to the computer work field, it had the most ping pong of most fields, I think, where it started as a female and then they were kicked out almost through like campaigns and towards like teenagers and young kids. They're thrown out of that field. Men start occupying it because realizing that it's like quite important. And then we also start seeing from a couple of institutions or trying to motivate women to come back, like young students to come back. And you see a bit of growth again of women in computer work and STEM fields. And obviously the men keep coming through. And this researcher actually saw that the flee of women never really affected the men. So this once again, this gender flight is actually much more one-sided because when the men flee, the women stay, that profession becomes more devalued. There's a decline of earnings, but the other way around did not happen within the same field of computer work. So we're not even comparing different fields, we're comparing within the same one, which had the most ping pong of like flights going on. And I thought that was very, very interesting. And also the fact that more men coming through did not make the women leave.
yeah, well,
So obviously we see who is the problem after all in this whole game. Who is the one who gets bothered and then pays less? And then he comes back when it seems important to them again.
yeah, I think also, a big part of it lies that in the end of the day, there's way more men in like leadership positions. And so the way those fields function, obviously, it's very top down. And so the people who are in leadership make the executive decision, and basically they can decide whether a certain field is worthy of their, attention and further development. And very, very often, once women start to dominate that, those people who are in leadership and who these women respond to are men. And so this all influences the dynamic. And in a sense, we're kind of doomed.
Yeah.
I love our very positive episodes. They're always very optimistic and happy. But I think I also sent you this TikTok the other day, or I was like a reel about women. I don't remember how the phenomenon was called now, but about like women being promoted to CEOs when the company is on the brink of collapse.
Yeah.
So, basically, when a company is about to, go down, very often, the men leaders resign or leave before it's too late, before it actually has happened. And very often, women are appointed in their position, firstly, because most men would not take a job like that because they have more opportunities. And so women kind of believe that, yeah, this is my only chance to
Yeah.
become a CEO, to become in such a higher position. But also because the management knows that it is the woman who's going to take the blame in the end if something goes wrong. And that's so like when I saw this, I was like, this is crazy. But I think it links to this idea so well because that kind of also is a sort of gender flight, as soon as something starts to go wrong, the men kind of remove themselves before it's too late. And then they kind of allow women to like fly into that space. Whereas actually they're just trying to have someone else take the responsibility for their own mess in a way. Um,
Yeah. It would be interesting to see if that happens specifically on promoting women, or if they would just promote a random person. Like, would they promote another guy who was just less experienced and we can just, put the blame on him, scapegoat him? Or is there like a specific statistics that we see women promotions happen more often during those times than not?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it would usually be down to those women because let's say you have a CEO of a company and then two people who are below him, and it's a man or a woman, and then the CEO leaves because he resigns, and then you have the man who's the contender and then the woman who's the contender. The man is probably gonna already go elsewhere because he has another offer that's better than that. Whereas
Mm.
the woman is kind of the one who, will probably take it because she doesn't have
Yeah.
any other options. At least that's what I think. Obviously, that's a very simplified view of it, but I think that's kind of what it's based on. And the
Yeah.
interesting thing is that like the women often manage to fix the situation, and then once that's done, someone else is ready to take the place.
Yeah, it's like doing the dirty work or the hard part, or even not just the hard part, but what it actually takes to be a leader kind of work. And then when the hard part is gone, it's like, well, now I can play being a boss again. You can leave now. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's even worse because if things go wrong, obviously it's not entirely her fault because if a company is sinking, there's nothing else you can do, no matter how great you are. It just keeps perpetuating this idea that women are not good leaders, which the more and more I feel like it's completely the opposite. I think in average, with no experience and with no proper training, women tend to be better leaders than men are. I don't know if this is a controversial opinion, but I generally believe it.
I was actually gonna say that I think there is even research done on it, but I think it's actually proven that women have a way more natural leadership skills just because people very often misunderstand what good leadership is. So people mostly focus on the idea of, authority and being big and strong as a man that you are. But actually, the being a good leader is about listening to people and identifying their strengths and weaknesses as well, and for which you have to be a very empathetic person naturally, because in order to understand that and in order to read people who you work with and make sure that they are working in the correct place and that they are doing what you want them to do and they're also happy doing it and that they respect you but also feel comfortable with you because they value you as their own leader. That's what a great leader should be, and women naturally tend to be more empathetic and good at that than men do.
Yeah. Besides that, even genetically, since women have been obliged to do for so many years and also seen their mothers, their grandmothers always managing a family or managing a house, that's exactly the same layout, the same thing of managing a
Yeah.
company, even managing a country. It's bound to the same type of skills, and women do have natural abilities to it because of all of those things. I don't know if you remember when I was doing my entrepreneurial project for uni a few years back, and I was reading this book for research, and so many of these wannabe entrepreneurs and wannabe leaders and CEOs really come about on like talking about these specific characteristics of a good leader. Blah, blah. It's like being optimistic, being this, and that, and all those qualities with empathy. These are all qualities that women naturally have more
Or
often
are
than
expected to have, like
or are expected to have with no training. And the fact that you are putting so much effort to just listen to other people's feelings when we've been doing that, or even it's expecting from us to do all the time, is one of the biggest scams I have enlightened myself with, of like women have just been leaders all the time and we've been convinced for so many years, for centuries, that
that
we
we're
are not.
not.
And that's insane. I think that's completely insane.
I know it's kind of crazy how the perspective is flipped because in a way those traits that you just described, they're used as a strength when they're exhibited in a man, but they're often portrayed as weaknesses in regards to women. So,
Yeah.
like empathy and being emotional is often considered, as weak or too emotional or, irrational because obviously how dare you exhibit any emotion in a workplace. Same with when it comes to optimism, it's you should always be happy, you should never get upset, you should always have a smile on your face. Like, why don't you just smile, darling? And those kind of things. And I think that basically the narrative that men have created for centuries is just, changed to whatever will suit them and will suit their pursuits. And it's very sad how ingrained that is within like society, to the point that we kind of start to believe that, and that obviously affects like generational biases and the whole structure of society in a sense. And when you think about it, it's kind of deep, like to think
Yeah.
about how it works.
And I also think it's like that was also one of my conclusions that these jobs, either be a leader or a CEO or a nurse or whatever, they have like certain gender expectations towards them, or they are gendered themselves. How easily malleable they are. You
Yeah.
know, like it's so easy to manipulate for you to think that this job is made for a man, it's not made for a woman. Like during my research, one of the examples that got me the most, oh, really, was cheerleading and how that
Yeah.
was seen as extremely masculine because you are yelling and directing crowds. And I was like, what? And today is seen as a non-real sport, a vain and for stupid girls.
Yeah,
That's
like
pretty much how you
super
see
sexualized.
that's how you see cheerleading. And to think that in just a few years, it was seen as extremely masculine and obviously no woman could do it, that was mind-blowing to me of how it's just so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous how we label things masculine or feminine when all these characteristics are so easily manipulative to be whatever you want it to be. Cheerleading could be as easily be a male sport or as easily a female sport. And perhaps the biggest conclusion we take out of this that it is none, is just a
It's a
sport.
sport.
Why are we gendering so much these activities? Like I cannot deal. Another example that I wanted to bring up because I think it touches me quite personally is teaching and being a professor,
Yeah,
because being a professor again exclusively was mostly for men, and it was seen as a very valuable position, and today is still seen in that way in the university level. But when we think about teachers and professors from the other school levels like high school, middle school, or even primary or elementary school, they are mostly women,
yeah,
and those teachers, they are just as the exact same profession, but
yeah,
those teachers are not seen as valuable or has the same prestige as an university professor, which is highly dominated by men in our position. And my mother is a professor and she teaches kids from 12 to 15 years old. And in Portugal, the profession of a teacher is extremely undervalued, to the point that their careers have been frozen by the government for many years now. Consequently, it is also very heavily female dominated.
yeah,
And you can totally see, especially because in the college here, most of them are public. So they have the same boss. My mom has the same boss as like a renowned chemistry professor in the university, blah, blah, blah. The state is their boss. They're exactly the same people. It's not like a private institution, any of that kind. And you can really see the disparity of value and prestige given to one and the other. And I generally think that the gender aspect has a total impact on it as well.
for sure.
And this also is seen on pay gaps and how my mom doesn't not get nearly enough of what she should be earning. And this also damages their look from other people. If you ask any kids, if you say, would you like to be a teacher? And they're like, hell no, I
Yeah,
would never want to be a teacher, because teachers are seen as losers, the ones who could not proceed in their careers being something else. So they are
yeah,
teachers.
or to teach a university, pretty much.
Yeah, and it's very annoying to see because I can think about my elementary teacher who was a woman and many other teachers I had, like math teacher and English teacher that I had that remarked me, and they were all women, you know? And it's very sad because elementary teachers and middle school teachers can be more impactful on your life than your university professor, because they are literally building up your base knowledge of the world
Yeah, for
way
sure.
earlier on in your life, and it had a much bigger impact than it looks like in the long run. And again, seeing that the college professors are way more protected, you have, for example, here in Portugal, a lot of cases of many cases of college professors with sexual assault reports
Mm.
and accusations. And again, it's from public institutions, so also run by the state. And they're way more protected. Their careers are not as damaged. Meanwhile, my mom has her career frozen because we need to make a sacrifice to help the state recover. And she is badly seen as as a professor just by simply being, and a college professor who is a man does not have his career damaged even if he's tried to rape a student.
That's crazy.
So, and this only happened when women started entering the teaching fields
Yeah,
and they start being undervalued and they start being paid less. Literally, that's how it started. And before, there was no distinction between an elementary teacher and a college professor at all.
that is
So,
like they had the same knowledge, the same education. So
yeah, I mean, more oftentimes to be any kind of level professor, you need to have a degree. Sometimes you need to have even a postgraduate degree in order to be able to teach. So yes, you do have the same level of education as a professor at a college has to teach kids of 6 years old. No, it doesn't matter, you know? But I think, yeah, I think there is a certain infantilization, I would say, of female labor that perhaps in this case of teaching that, oh, if you're teaching 5-year-olds, that's not as serious or as complex or as difficult as teaching law in King's College of London. You know what I mean? And perhaps that professor would never be able to teach a 6-year-old or how to write blue
yeah.
in a sense of like you would say it and the kid would not learn, so you cannot teach them. Similar to that, I also kind of notice studying in general, and especially when it comes to higher education, is also seen a bit of a flee of men or young men fleeing from university education and more women coming through. I don't know if you've noticed that, but
Yeah, I did think about that as well because I feel a lot of boys, men are now kind of promoting this like model of like, oh, you don't need a degree to be a successful entrepreneur.
Mhm, mhm.
Um,
Exactly.
and so more women are actually going into corporate education, which is something we weren't allowed to or didn't have the resources to do before. Whereas men are kind of, oh no, we're already like above that. We're so over this. Being in university is passé. Now it's
Mhm.
Bitcoin, you know, and that's how we
Now we are
roll.
Bitcoin.
And we're here like reading fucking philosophy books, you know, when we should just be selling Bitcoin and we're totally missing out.
Yeah, but I think that aspect, as you referenced, that we didn't have that access for the longest of times.
Yeah.
So of course we perhaps value it a bit more. Or perhaps we're also kind of aware that if we don't have a college degree, no one is going to take us seriously as you would take the next man on the street if he speaks to you with nice words.
Yeah, I generally think it's mostly that. I feel like women tend to make themselves almost overqualified or like
Yeah.
apply for the positions that they're way overqualified for just because they think they don't have a shot otherwise.
Yeah, and there's still an increase. And even when I was just at like school, in average, the girls would be more successful, like academically and in their grades, even when we were 12 or 13, it doesn't matter, than the boys were.
Yeah.
And that kept being the thing when going to university to the point that you had way more young girls enrolling in universities than guys were. Even though, of course, there's specific fields more dominated by one on the other, but in general, for like the whole university with all the courses, there were way more women or young women enrolled in universities and having a higher success rate at academics than men were. And I think maybe the last 10 years, I'll say out loud or a bit more, that we are seeing that narrative of men building for themselves, like, oh, we don't need this anymore. And consequently, it is related to more women enrolling ever since maybe like the 70s, 80s,
Yeah.
when the children of those people started enrolling all in the 2000s, 2010s. They're the ones who enrolled more, and that was way a big crescendo of women enrolling when men started to leave and building these entrepreneurial narratives that we don't need a degree to be successful.
Yeah.
And the sad reality is that it's true. You don't need a degree to be successful, but women won't be taken seriously in any other way. They already aren't with a degree, much less without it. And that's the sad bit. But again, we see a male flight once even higher education is started being more dominated by young female students than male students. And I
Yeah.
thought that was also quite interesting
Yeah, that's
seeing.
very true. I feel like this phenomenon, it permeates kind of almost every field. of our life to an extent. And I feel like it's gonna become more and more present because of how rapidly those fields are changing and how big new trends are coming in and how big new technologies are. And I think that I was thinking about that and when I was doing the research and I'm like, is it ever gonna stop, you know? And I don't think it will because I don't think that men will change their perspective for like years and years and years to come. And so they will kind of always regard those female dominated areas as lesser in a sense. And so
Yeah.
that phenomenon will kind of like keep occurring in one way or another, which is quite sad. But I don't know, I guess the only positive, yeah, what did you want to say?
I have a master plan
Okay.
for all the girlies who are listening to this episode. We should invade every single field to the point there's no escape. Therefore, they have nowhere to fly to, and we dominate the
Oh,
world.
so there is like no other fields to go into.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Then I would be very impressed in whatever they would be able to create in order to like fly somewhere. Perhaps they can all go to the moon
Yeah, they
instead.
can. They would probably like buy an island or some shit and like create their colony there, you know?
Yeah, then they're gonna say that living
That's
in
what
the
I
city
imagine.
is so feminine and so not it anymore.
The earth is passe, you know? We don't
Yeah,
really we're gonna live in the ocean now.
at the bottom of the ocean.
Let's
So
hope.
yeah, that's my plan, girls. Everyone listening, female identifier, go to those places, those fields, dominate the shit out of them, and leave them no escape to go, and we'll fix the world. There you go.
Hopefully. Hopefully. Yeah, if only that was this easy, I swear. But well, yeah, hopefully like more women will come into high leadership positions and we'll be able to challenge it from there. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that also would have a bit more over control of these fluctuations as well. Because as you said, sure, we can like do all this, but if the higher managers are all men, then things won't really change ever, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, so yeah, and also just stop with this silliness of labeling as masculine and labeling something as feminine, because I think that's the easiest way to then say for us to not think that feminine equals inferior.
Yeah.
Like if we just stop labeling as such, like why it should be one or the other anyway? Like it's ridiculous, especially when we see how volatile those characteristics actually are. That's so easy. You can like put a perspective onto this obviously is super masculine or this obviously is super feminine. And I'm like, well, maybe not so obvious. I mean, it depends on your perspective. And perhaps that means that there's actually no boxes. You're just making them when they're not even real.
Yeah.
And the problem is the real life consequence that actually has on society, which is basically what we see. So yeah, I don't know. I think honestly, I'm so done with and tired of label things one or the other. Let's just things be. It's
Yeah.
just a job after all. You're you're just a marketing specialist. There's nothing that deep about it. It's not feminine, it's not masculine, you know what I mean? Like, it's just a job. And I don't know. But I also feel that, we both were talking together about this, that there's actually not that much information. This is more of a fun fact kind of topic.
Yeah.
And I think since one of the prevailing topics on sexism in 21st century has a lot to do with jobs, professions, pay gaps, and all of that stuff, I think it's more of an issue that maybe we should try and develop a bit further and talk a bit more about
Yeah.
this like gender flight phenomenon, because I think it can also explain a lot about the pay gaps that exist, can talk about the sexism in workplaces and many other of like the main topics that we talk about in feminist theory, I guess. Job and financial security is such a big thing of feminism and so important for women that I think this topic should be more talked about, and there's not that much information on it.
Yeah, it is very true. I feel like it kind of, as you said, it ties like all of these subtopics and issues together in a sense, and they kind of all stem from each other and are very interconnected. So it would be great to, see more about it and also by learning more about it, kind of incorporate some changes in policies and maybe even regulations that would kind of, help prevent that from happening and help prevent those female dominated fields from being so devalued and actually, blatantly describe it for what it is, which is gender discrimination. And
Yeah. and explain some effects as well, and explain some social behaviors that we have towards certain professions, but also our own choices in life, you know, as you said, like women choosing biology or choosing this over that. It also explains those social behaviors if you study these phenomenons more deeply. So yeah, this is our plea for share this episode, share this info with your relatives,
Spread the
and
word.
yeah, spread the word. Manifest.
Exactly. Go women.
Oh,
Dominate the workforce.
yeah, and I guess with that we can wrap up this episode. We don't know exactly when this episode is going to come out, but I hope you're still enjoying the heat wave that we're enjoying right now today. Global warming never felt this good. I'm having lemon water, having the
Healthy
time of my life.
detox queen.
hmm So yeah, thank you for listening. I hope you had a great time,
And
and we'll see
we'll
you.
talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.